tonight. What are the differences between the Republican and Democratic parties? Town meeting tonight.
Welcome, town meeting friends, to historic Town Hall in New York City, where the sound of the moderator's gavel will bring to order another session of America's Town Meeting of the Air. The subject of our discussion tonight: what are the essential differences between the Republican and Democratic parties? As speakers, we are proud to have with us Dr. Glenn Frank, Chairman of the Republican Program Committee, and the Honorable Robert H. Jackson, Attorney General of the United States. May I now present your moderator, Mr. George V. Denny, Jr., President of Town Hall and founder of America's Town Meeting of the Air. Mr. Denny.
Good evening, neighbors. The question really is, since when did the rank and file of the Republican Party, and I suppose of any party, choose the candidates at a convention?
Again, that's of a piece with the answer I made in part on the wages and hours question. During the last 2 years, the Republican Party has been engaged in an extensive process of thoroughly democratizing one of the most important party processes, namely the formulation of policy, and doing it at a time when the Democratic Party's process of policy making has been becoming increasingly autocratic and centralized.
The question as to the amount, I haven't the figures in mind. But of course, the net collections of the government depend not merely on the rate, but upon the number of people who enjoy those incomes. There were more people who enjoyed or thought they enjoyed those incomes in 1929 and those years before, and reported on that basis. I don't think that you can successfully contend that a low rate will produce more income for the government if you apply it to the same base. You're applying two different eras, comparing two different eras, and applying to them two different bases.
Thank you. Next question. Do you agree that the statement that government, yes, who governed least, applies in 1940?
I do not believe that the bald statement, that government which governs least is the best government, applies to the complicated and interdependent situation of 1940 in this or any other modern civilization.
How about the action in Congress?
I would be, as one of the mellowers and sanctifiers of or to put it in short, I want to answer that question, Mr. Denny.
Yes, sure.
In other words, in shorthand, as a Republican, I would be perfectly happy to have someone who knew the details make a detailed comparison between the cordial cooperation of the Republican forces under the New Deal with valid progressive legislation with the obstructive forces of the Democratic element in the Congress when the Hoover administration was advancing.
I would like to ask you how the New Deal, as it gets in, proposes to re-employ the 11 million unemployed if it continues with punitive policies for business and the harassment of business.
There has been no punitive policy toward business. There has been a distinct effort to curtail some kinds of business in the interest of other kinds of business. The Federal Trade Commission acts on a complaint by some businessmen that other businessmen are being unfair to it. Every suit that has been instituted by the Department of Justice against business groups has been instituted at the request and upon the complaint of other groups of businessmen who claimed they were being ruined. Government must arbitrate those differences and must take a position in reference to those groups.
I would like to address my question to both speakers. In the light of recent foreign developments, do you think America should continue to purchase gold from foreign countries so as to create purchasing power in those foreign countries so as to aid our foreign export trade?
Frank, well, now that's a question on money.
Now you're getting over into the field of money, and when you get there, I'm in exactly the same position that the monetary experts are. I don't know a single thing about it. Except instead of saying, should we continue to buy the gold, I think it had been far better if we hadn't bought as much as we have.
Mr. Jackson, you know anything about money?
It's very apparent that isn't one of the differences between Dr. Frank and myself. The question is addressed to the differences between us.
What do you plan as the present administration for putting idle money back to work?
The administration has had a program of attempting to raise the purchasing power of the people in the lower class income groups who are the great purchasers of the nation. Those are the groups that spend their money. If you recall, when the Depression hit the motor industry, one of the explanations which was given was that there was no longer ability to dispose of used cars. And used cars are the product which are sold to people of low income. It's the belief of the group that if you can restore purchasing power so that business has customers, the idle money will go to work supplying the needs of those customers. And that primarily the reason that business is down is because customers aren't available to buy its goods.
Now, Dr. Frank, will you comment on that same question?
Thanks to Mr. Jackson for dramatizing at least one very profound difference between the Democratic and Republican parties today. I agree with Mr. Jackson, and I agree with the most ardent New Dealers that you can't keep this high-powered productive system going without customers who have money in their pocket with which to buy the output of that productive system. But I dissent heartily, as does the Republican Party generally, from the idea that you can create purchasing power adequate to keep this high-powered productive machine going by either government-made work or elaborate government spending of borrowed money. As a very temporary shot in the arm to overcome a serious, acute condition, yes. As a going economic process, no. All the record of the experiment is against it.
Thank you. Ruth wants to know what definite steps your party will take to keep America out of war.
I think the program of the administration has been made very clear in the legislation which was proposed by the President and enacted. There has been no indication of a likelihood of our getting into the war. And the legislation is certainly adequate up to any present needs.
Thank you.
What proposals does the Republican Party have for putting the 10 or 11 or whatever number of million of unemployed there are back to work? Every attitude, every expression of the temper of Republican leadership, and every policy incorporated in the report of the Republican Program Committee was directed at the target of revitalizing and re-energizing the basic health of American business, industry, and agriculture, on the assumption that only as the organic health of the economic enterprise of this entire nation is returned are you going to get a genuine reabsorption of the unemployed into the ranks of the employed. You can't do it on made work unless you want to stabilize the living standards of this people at a markedly lower level and herd them into armament plants or troop them down the streets on made work.
Thank you. What is former President Hoover's reaction to your report? Is he opposed to it?
I can answer that question. Mr. Hoover was a member of the committee, cooperated in the drafting of the report, and the last time I heard him refer to it, he said he felt it was an excellent expression of the political, social, and economic principles in which he had believed and which he had preached for the last 20 years.
Is a deficit of 40 billion plus a peril?
To be perfectly frank with you, I don't know. I have read a great deal that has been written on both sides of the subject. Whether it's a peril, I can't answer. It doesn't seem to me that a deficit created to feed our own people, a deficit for public works which are created in this country, represented by schoolhouses and projects throughout the land, can bankrupt us.
Same question. Mr. Frank, do you think that a deficit of 40 billion plus is a national peril?
You mean a national debt of $40 billion? Yes. Now, I say that. Now, let me make clear the spirit in which I say it and the grounds on which I say it. And about 3 sentences will state those grounds. I do not say that potentially this economic system of ours can't stand up under a national debt of 40 or even $50 billion. But I do say that a national debt that has jumped, that has virtually doubled in 7 years, is symptomatic of a political and economic philosophy which, if given its head, will land the nation in bankruptcy because of the policies that create that larger debt.
Having heard the talk on both sides of the very few differences between the Democratic and the Republican Party, I wish to ask Mr. Jackson if he doesn't think the Republican Party could run on the last Democratic platform that was ever written in 1932 better than the present New Deal Party. Well, that's an imaginary question. You can speak on that if you want to, Mr. Jackson.
Well, I think they not only should run on the platform of the Democratic Party, but they should endorse its candidate if they feel as they say they do.
Could you say that the New Deal was not calculated to be a benefit to those who lived on their investments rather than upon their services to society?
Well, I did not say that.
Well, I'm glad to hear it, sir. I wanted to ask you a question.
I said that the proposed reduction of taxes was entirely directed to the benefit of those who lived on investments and had no effect on those who lived on wages, salaries, or earned income. But what I do say is that when you have reached the point where you are living on the return from invested capital, it evidences an ability to pay, and that is a proper element to take into consideration in fixing the tax rate, that the progressive tax should apply according to ability to pay, graduated according to income.
Mr. Landon's reaction to your report. Trying to get these candidates lined up behind your report one way or another.
The question is, do I know Mr. Landon's attitude towards this report? Mr. Landon gave his hearty approval to this report in a public statement about 48 hours after it was issued.
Dr. Bester has a question from a listener out of the town. Yes?
Mr. Jackson, on the issues of foreign policy, what are the major differences between the Republican and Democratic parties?
I couldn't answer that because I can't find out what the foreign policy of the Republican Party is. Not only are there differences between its candidates, but its candidates sometimes have different policies when they're speaking in different parts of the country. I don't think it's feasible or practical to draw a comparison between a policy which is in effect under the present administration with the hypothetical policies of hypothetical candidates drawn from a variety of speeches under a variety of circumstances with no continuity and no consistency among them.
Again, I'm speaking tonight very dogmatically about Republican policy because of my 2 years' experience of intimate contact with thousands and thousands of rank-and-file Republicans whose judgment I know is going to prevail ultimately in the Republican Party, regardless of what any individual leader may say, think, or do. I'm as much at sea as to where the foreign policy of the New Deal is really headed, as Mr. Jackson is, about what the foreign policy of the Republican Party is. If I had to say it in about 3 or 4 sentences, I'd say that the demand coming up from the rank and file of the Republicans to the leadership of the Republican Party is, first of all, keep this nation out of the wars of Europe. Second, realize, nevertheless, that this is an interdependent world economically and culturally, and you must go to the extreme limit of cooperation in making possible the easiest possible flow of trade and services across the frontiers of the world, provided in the doing of it you don't have to sell out the living standards of American workers and American farmers.
I think Dr. Frank is better qualified to answer this question. How do you reconcile the following essential difference in the situation that's paradoxical? In 1938, President Roosevelt, in speaking before a group of women representing national associations, said that to help recovery, quote, buy patriotically, end quote. In 1939, President Roosevelt, in speaking before a large group of newspaper men holding forth a can of Argentine beef, said he was advocating that the American Navy buy Argentine beef because it was cheaper.
All right, you're asked to verify President Roosevelt's apparently two inconsistent remarks. Mr. Frank.
In the spirit of good manners and sportsmanship, I'm going to pass the beef to Mr. Jackson.
Mr. Jackson passes the beef back to the audience as we take the next question. Yes. Frank.
I am not here to apologize for the leadership of the Republican Party in the past. Because the cold historic record is that most of the political, social, and economic progress that America has made in the last half century has been made under Republican leadership. I don't think the rank and file sentiment of the Republican Party is a blind blanket thumbs down on the technique of reciprocal trade agreements. I'm not talking about any special one. I think the majority of Republicans in this country are skeptical of the handing over of too much unchecked and unreviewed power to administrators. But they've had such a dose of that in the last 7 years that you can forgive them that.
Thank you, Mr. Frank. And with your remarks, we bring to a close the 27th and final broadcast of the 1939 season.